The resurrection of Jesus. Just as all the Gospels agree on the passion, crucifixion and death of Jesus, they also agree completely on the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Matthew chapter 28 verse 1 to 8, Mark 16 to 1 to 8, Luke chapter 24 verse 1 to 12, John chapter 20 verse 1 to 10. The Gospels record that this resurrection happened in fulfillment of Jesus' passion predictions, that after he was killed, he would rise on the third day. Matthew chapter 16 verse 21, 20:18 to 19, Mark 8:31, 9:31, 10:32 to 34, Luke chapter 9 verse 21 to 22, 18:31 to 34. Matthew chapter 27 verse 62 to 64, Luke chapter 24 verse 6 to 8. It is important to note that while modern-day counting of days shows that Friday to Sunday morning is not 3 full days, the only full day is the Sabbath. However, according to Jewish reckoning, any part of a day was counted as a full day. Jesus was in the tomb on Friday afternoon, all day Saturday and on Sunday morning. According to Jewish time, that would have counted as 3 days. Though there are differences in the Gospel accounts on the resurrection that appear contradictory, they all share the same core events. A small group of women visit the tomb early on Sunday morning to anoint Jesus' body and found that the tomb was empty. They also received a message from a heavenly messenger confirming that Jesus is risen. The Gospels also record that Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week, Sunday, the day after the Sabbath, Saturday. Matthew chapter 28 verse 1 to 6, Mark chapter 16 verse 1 to 6, Luke chapter 23 verse 53 to 24 to 6, John chapter 20 verse 1 ff. This confirms that the biblical Sabbath is the seventh day of the week, which is still Saturday. The celebration of the resurrection during the Easter period is one of the best evidences to support this fact. While many Christians sincerely worship on Sunday as the Sabbath because Jesus resurrected on that day, there is no biblical command or evidence to keep Sunday as the Sabbath. The fourth commandment of the 10 Commandments command all to remember the Sabbath day on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath of the Lord. Exodus chapter 20 verse 8 to 11. Sunday worship by Christians based on the resurrection of Jesus on that day is not biblical and is simply the practice of a human tradition. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Is the resurrection of Jesus a truly authentic historical fact? There has been debate and controversy over these questions over the years. However, there appears to be strong historical evidence to support the reality and authenticity of the resurrection of Jesus. Here are a few of them. The historical reliability of the Gospels. There were points given to support the historical reliability of the Gospels. If it is accepted that the Gospels are verified and trustworthy historical documents which contain accurately recorded real historic events in the life and ministry of Jesus, then the resurrection must be historically valid and true. With the support of oral tradition preceding the writing of the Gospels, written from real verifiable eyewitness accounts within the same century of the event and the witnesses of the early church fathers in the 2nd century AD, the Gospels can be trusted as reliable historical documents and the resurrection can be regarded as true. The death of Jesus. Some critics have argued that Jesus did not really die when he was buried in the tomb. They state that either Jesus was in a coma in the tomb or was given a drug that sent him into a death-like state until he was in the tomb and woke up from out of it. These theories, however, ignore the fact that Jesus was confirmed dead at the cross even before his body was brought down. The Roman soldier pierced Jesus in his side to ensure that he was dead. If he was not dead, then that would have truly settled it. It must be remembered that the Roman soldiers were experts at killing people. It was their job, and they did it very well. They knew without a doubt when a person was dead, and really, it's not so terribly difficult to figure out. Besides, if a prisoner somehow escaped, the responsible soldiers would be put to death themselves, so they had a huge incentive to make sure that each victim was dead when he was removed from the cross. Therefore, for Jesus to have truly resurrected, he must have truly died. The empty tomb. It has also been proposed that the tomb the women and the disciples went to look for Jesus was the wrong tomb. It is claimed that these women followers of Jesus, and subsequently the disciples, mistook the location of the tomb because it was semi-dark on early Sunday of the resurrection. However, the narratives imply that the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea was a specific well-known tomb, known by both Jews and Romans, by both believers and unbelievers of the resurrection. If it was the wrong tomb, the enemies of the resurrection would have gone to the right tomb and pull out the decaying body of Jesus as evidence that he was still dead. This was not the case. The Jewish leaders could not prove that Jesus' resurrection was a lie. In fact, they knew the truth of the resurrection from the Roman guards who were the very witnesses of the event. The tomb was empty not because the disciples stole the body. If the Roman soldiers confessed that the body of Jesus was stolen by the disciples, which they were bribed to tell, Matthew chapter 28 verses 11 to 15, their very lives were at stake for failing in the duty to protect the tomb. The post-resurrection appearances. Perhaps one of the greatest evidences for the resurrection is the appearances of Jesus to many people after his resurrection. These appearances definitely explain why there is an empty tomb and what happened to the body of Jesus. It was raised by the power of God. The Gospels and other New Testament references record these appearances. The following are key examples: Mary Magdalene, John chapter 20 verses 10 to 18, the women, Matthew chapter 28 verses 8 to 10, Peter, Luke chapter 24 verse 34, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 5, disciples on the way to Emmaus, Luke chapter 24 verses 13 to 35, the 10 disciples with Thomas absent, Luke chapter 24 verses 36 to 40, John chapter 20 verses 19 to 23, cf. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 5, the 11 disciples with Thomas present, John chapter 20 verses 24 to 29, the 7 apostles in Galilee, John chapter 21 verse 1 to 14, 500 disciples, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 6, Matthew chapter 28 verses 16 to 20, James, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 7, disciples at the ascension, Luke chapter 24 verses 50 to 52, Acts chapter 1 verses 3 to 8. Apart from these references, the book of Acts also mentions that Jesus walked around alive for 40 days after his resurrection with many convincing proofs of the resurrection. Acts chapter 1 verse 3. He was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, as witnesses to the people. Acts chapter 13 verse 31. This is strong undeniable evidence that Jesus was really alive. So, in addition to the empty tomb, the risen living Jesus appeared resurrected around the same vicinity where he has lived, ministered and died. The existence and spread of the Church. Another great historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is the continual existence and spread of the Christian Church. It is a historical fact that the Christian Church spread in a dramatic way from a small number of believers in Jerusalem and grew until it reached to Rome, the capital city of the Roman Empire and beyond. The Roman historian Tacitus confirms this in his writings as seen in the following quote. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom their name is derived, had suffered the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but even in Rome, the capital itself. The question is, what made this possible? What caused a group of scared and scattered disciples after the death of Jesus to become a formidable force that grew and spread so rapidly and reached Caesar's palace in Rome within a period of about 20 years, triumphing over a number of competing ideologies and eventually overwhelmed the entire Roman Empire? Could the stealing of the body of Jesus by the disciples result in this growth? The disciples could not have stolen the body of Jesus. They were already discouraged, afraid, and were not strong or trained enough to fight off the Roman guard. Could it be that Jesus wasn't really dead in the tomb, that he swooned, fainted, on the cross and resuscitated in the tomb, pushed the stone away and passed by the Roman guard and appeared to his disciples as a resuscitated, badly wounded Jesus who escaped from the tomb? Would be a pathetic picture that would not inspire disciples to preach that he is Lord of life and has triumphed over death and the grave. The following quotes make this clear. After suffering that horrible abuse, with all the catastrophic blood loss and trauma, he would have looked so pitiful that the disciples would never have hailed him as a victorious conqueror over death. They would have felt sorry for him and tried to nurse him back to life. So it's preposterous to think that if he had appeared to them in that awful state, his followers would have been prompted to start a worldwide movement based on the hope that someday they too would have a resurrection body like his. There's just no way. What explanation shows how discouraged and frightened, cowardly disciples become transformed into courageous and bold preachers even to death by martyrdom? They had seen the risen Jesus, and that made all the difference. The Jews who believed in a bodily resurrection had checked and the well-known tomb was empty. The presence of the empty grave clothes in the tomb, John chapter 20 verses 5 to 7, presupposes the belief that the body of Jesus had been transformed and nothing of it remained. The presence of Jesus' body, on the other hand, would have been proof that he had not risen from the dead. The proclamation in Jerusalem that Jesus was alive and risen from the dead meant that his dead body no longer lay in the tomb. It is furthermore inconceivable that those Jews who opposed Jesus and his followers would not have checked for themselves to see if the tomb was empty. All they would have needed to do to discredit the early Christian proclamation was to produce the body of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus can be said to be the central doctrine of the Christian faith. On it is hinged the essence of Christianity. The following are 3 key points on the significance of the resurrection of Jesus. Hope beyond death. A very key point of the gospel message of Christians from the Bible is in relation to the resurrection of Jesus is that death does not have the final word. Because Jesus resurrected from death, there is future hope of resurrection for Christian believers. For those who believe in Jesus, death is not the end because he has conquered death and the grave, Revelation chapter 1 verse 18, and his resurrection is an assurance of the reality of their resurrection if they die, John chapter 11 verse 25, 14-19, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 16 to 19. There is therefore no need for Christians to fear death because Jesus' resurrection also ensures that people are freed from the slavery of the fear of death. Hebrews chapter 2 verses 14 to 15. Jesus' resurrection gives hope to Christians that face suffering, tragedy and death. Hope of a better resurrection, a resurrection to eternal life. Daniel chapter 12 verse 2, John chapter 5 verses 28 to 29. If they die having faith in Jesus, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verse 16, baptism and communion. These 2 Christian rituals have Jewish background and roots but have been transformed by the resurrection of Jesus. Baptism was traditionally used by Jews to bring in Gentile proselytes to Judaism. However, the early Christian church adopted baptism to represent a person's public acceptance of Jesus' death and resurrection. Going under the water was a celebration of Christ's death, and by being brought out of the water was a celebration of the fact that Jesus was raised to newness of life. The resurrection of Jesus is the assurance that, through baptism, a person's old life is dead and buried and the person can rise again, to begin living a new life in Jesus Christ. Romans chapter 6 verses 1 to 5. The communion service derives from the Passover meal of the Jewish feast. It was celebrated with Jesus and his disciples before he went to the cross. It was a celebration of Jesus' death as the Passover lamb that brought freedom from sin and death. The early Christians celebrated the execution and death of Jesus, because they were convinced that they had seen him alive from the tomb. However, the meal was not just a memorial of the past, Jesus' death. It also pointed forward to the time when Jesus will eat and drink with his disciples in the future kingdom of glory after his second coming as Son of Man. Cf. Matthew chapter 26 verse 29, Mark 14:25, Luke chapter 22 verses 15 to 16, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 23, 26. This future reunion in glory will only be possible because of Jesus' resurrection. Therefore, the resurrection of Jesus transformed the Jewish rite of baptism and the Jewish feast of Passover to have significance for the Christian life and church. The present reality of Jesus. One of the key significant points of Jesus' resurrection is the fact that he is still alive and active in the world today through the Holy Spirit. Cf. John chapter 14 verses 16 to 18, 15:26, 16:13 to 15. If, as Christians maintain, Jesus has risen from the dead, then such a personal and immediate experience of the risen living Christ is open to all who would seek for themselves to taste and see.